Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. When you look at your life from the outside, it seems like everything is going according to plan. You're in a comfort zone where everything is predictable and calm. But sometimes something unexpected happens that disrupts the usual course of things. For me, that event was the arrival of a new neighbor. Although if someone had told me this would change my life, I would have just laughed. After all, at first glance, nothing foreshadowed trouble. I was standing by the kitchen window, preparing breakfast. The morning was ordinary. Kale was reading the news on his tablet, muttering something grimly about politicians, and I was trying to mentally prepare for the upcoming workday. We lived in a quiet suburb, where every detail of life was predictable and unchanging. The same neighbors, the same streets, the same routine. But that day, something new appeared. I noticed him when I first glanced at the house across the street. Oliver. I didn't know his name yet, but even then, he caught my attention. Tall, fit, with a short beard and a calm confidence in every movement. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, but there was something about him that made me linger my gaze. In his hands was a cardboard box, and he was stepping out of a truck, leisurely heading towards his new home. I was struck by how easily he moved, as if every step was thought out and deliberate. "A new neighbor?" I asked innocently, as if there was nothing significant in those words. Kyle didn't even look up, continuing to scroll through articles. My attempt to start a conversation was once again crushed by his indifference, and I returned to my thoughts. Oliver had only moved into our neighborhood a couple of days ago. Moving to a quiet place like ours often sparked curiosity and discussions among the neighbors. But with Oliver, it was different. He quickly went inside the house without exchanging a single word with anyone. I had seen him from the window a few times, but never dared to go out and say hello. That morning, like many others, was supposed to pass in peace and quiet. But the strange excitement didn't leave me from the moment I saw Oliver. His presence made me look at my own life in a new way. At Kyle, sitting across from me at the table, at our quiet and predictable marriage. When I left the house that day to take out the trash, I had no idea I would meet him. Oliver was just parking his car. Our eyes met, and I felt something stir inside me. He smiled, his brown eyes looking directly at me. "Hi," he spoke first, taking a step toward me. "I'm Oliver, your new neighbor." "Ellie," I responded with an awkward smile, trying to keep my composure. "Welcome to the neighborhood." Oliver was friendly, but there was a slight mystery in his gaze, as if he saw more than just a new acquaintance. We exchanged a few polite phrases, and I tried not to look into his eyes for too long. They were too deep, as if they could peer inside me. "If you need help with the move, don't hesitate to ask," I said, realizing I might come across as intrusive. But Oliver just nodded gratefully and said he'd take me up on the offer if needed. When I returned home, Kale was still engrossed in his own world, and I realized I hadn't felt anything like what I had during that brief conversation with Oliver in a long time. It wasn't something overt, just a subtle tension, unclear but exhilarating. In the following days, I tried not to think about him, but thoughts of the neighbor often surfaced in my mind on their own. Oliver always appeared unexpectedly, whether by his car or while walking down the street. And each time, our eyes met. I caught myself enjoying when he looked at me, and I enjoyed it more than I should have. Sometimes I would notice him working in his garden or bringing home more boxes, as if they held his entire life. Oliver wasn't the type of man I would have been immediately interested in, but there was that charisma in him, that elusive magnetism that made it hard to look away. Like magic, and that magic began to envelop me. Of course, I tried to convince myself it was all just a trick of the mind, that my marriage with Kyle was still strong, even if a bit boring. But those looks that Oliver and I exchanged seemed to ignite something in me that had long been buried under layers of routine. Something that reminded me of youth, of freedom, and of emotions that had long been forgotten. Every day, I felt that strange excitement more and more whenever I saw Oliver. And then one evening, as I was coming home from work, I saw him again. He was standing by his house, looking at me. But this time, something had changed. His eyes didn't just show the courtesy of a neighbor. There was interest, almost a challenge, as if he knew what I was thinking about him. "Ellie, are you okay?" Kale's voice broke through, pulling me back to reality. I turned around and saw him standing in the doorway. He was still there, playing his familiar role of the husband, but his questions sounded almost automatic. Cale was focused on his own matters, not noticing how the world around him was changing. "Yes, everything's fine," I replied, tearing my gaze away from Oliver. But inside, I knew things were far from simple. And from that moment on, something new began. Something I could never have predicted. It all started with one casual walk. The day was sunny, and I decided to go for a run in the park. It was my escape, the place where I could forget about problems and routines. The park was quiet and peaceful, a place where I could get away from everything. I loved those moments of solitude, when only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the light rhythm of my footsteps filled the silence. But this time, something was different. I was running along my usual path when, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a familiar figure. Oliver. He was walking towards me, looking relaxed and confident. His t-shirt and sweatpants emphasized his toned figure, and I felt a slight flutter inside. Why did his presence affect me so much? It was inexplicable, but in that moment, I couldn't think about anything other than his gaze fixed on me. Our eyes met, and I felt my heart start to race. That look. It was deeper than before, as if there was something in it I couldn't decipher. It wasn't just a polite greeting, it was like a silent conversation, full of unspoken words and hints. I suddenly realized that his presence had become something more to me than just neighborly friendship. "Hi, Ellie," his calm voice came as I reached him. I stopped, trying to hide my excitement. "Oliver," I replied with a smile, trying not to reveal my inner turmoil. "Nice weather for a walk." He nodded, his lips curving into a barely noticeable smile. "Yeah, I love days like this. Time to unwind." We exchanged just a few sentences, but it was enough for me to feel that something new was beginning between us. Something that couldn't be called a simple friendship. I felt it even more when his gaze lingered on me a bit longer than would be appropriate for mere acquaintances. I continued my run, but thoughts of Oliver didn't leave me. I couldn't understand why his presence affected me so much. After all, I was married, and my marriage with Cale, though calm, still seemed solid. But in recent years, maybe both of us had lost the passion that once connected us. And now Oliver appeared, like a spark capable of igniting something new. The next day, I went to the park again, not hoping but somehow subconsciously expecting to meet him. And of course, I saw him. This time, he was sitting on a bench, leaning back with a book in his hands. His calmness and relaxation were almost contagious, and as I approached, I caught his gaze once more. He slowly raised his head and smiled, as if he knew I wasn't here by accident. "Do you often come here?" I asked, feeling my heart begin to race again. "Yeah, I love this park. It's peaceful, and a good place to unwind after the day," he replied, never breaking eye contact. We exchanged a few more brief sentences, but this time, I stayed nearby. Oliver told me a bit about his life, how he had moved to this area to start fresh. And suddenly, I realized that his life, full of change and freedom, was such a stark contrast to mine. With every word he said, I felt a connection forming between us. I could no longer deny that his presence stirred something in me, something strange, but pleasant. It wasn't just interest, it was something more, something I was afraid to admit to myself, but could no longer ignore. We sat on that bench in the park, and every time our eyes met, I felt a spark pass between us. His calmness and confidence made me feel comfortable and alive. As if with every word he spoke, I was becoming part of his world, freer than the one I had been living in for the past few years. When I returned home, Cale was still absorbed in his own tasks, and I realized how different his way of life was from what I felt when I was near Oliver. It was like two different worlds, and I suddenly began to understand that one of them no longer satisfied me. Each meeting with Oliver in the park felt random, but I knew there was nothing random about it. I began to think that he represented everything I was missing: freedom, confidence, passion. And though I tried to push those thoughts away, they came back again and again. But the strangest thing was that Oliver seemed to feel the same way. His looks, his words, they spoke to me more than I allowed myself to admit. Every time we met in the park, I saw in his eyes something that couldn't be hidden. And that scared me, because I knew that this world he was pulling me into could destroy everything I had known up to that point. I couldn't predict what would happen next. But one thing I knew for sure: something had developed between Oliver and me that would change my life. And perhaps that moment in the park was only the beginning of what was yet to come. I don't often go to cafes alone. Usually, it's something like a small ritual. Weekends with Kyle, when we sit at a table by the window and order the same thing. But that day, I decided to make an exception. It was morning, light rain was falling outside, and I suddenly wanted to stop for a cup of coffee before running my errands. This place always attracted me with its cozy atmosphere and the smell of freshly baked pastries that gently filled the air. I ordered my latte and sat at a table by the window, watching the passersby hurrying under their umbrellas. I felt a slight tiredness after the work week, but it was a pleasant feeling, as if I could slow down for a moment, forget all my worries. And then I saw him. Oliver entered the cafe as if it were the most ordinary thing. I noticed him instantly. He was in a black leather jacket and jeans, a calm, barely perceptible smile playing on his face. He moved as confidently and easily as always, and before I could do anything, our eyes met again. "Ellie?" he asked, slightly surprised, though I noticed something in his voice that made me feel special. "Hello." "Hi," I replied, trying to hide the sudden surge of excitement. "Just dropped by?" Oliver nodded, casting a brief glance at the line by the counter. "Yeah, thought I'd grab some coffee before a meeting. Can I sit?" He motioned to the empty chair across from me, and I nodded, though inside, a storm of emotions was raging. Oliver sat down across from me, and for a few seconds, silence hung in the air. I tried to act natural, but the strange tension that always arose in his presence only grew stronger. "How was your week?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. "Same as usual," I answered, trying not to seem too interested. "Work? Home? Nothing new?" Oliver looked at me intently, as if searching for something in my words. "I see. Not many surprises in this neighborhood." We both laughed. It was funny, but I caught something more in his words than just a joke, as if he was hinting that my life could be far more interesting. "And you? How's it going?" I decided to shift the focus to him, feeling like I was talking too much about myself. "Not bad," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The move was tough, but I'm slowly settling in. New job, new people. Everything feels fresh." I nodded, sensing that the conversation was becoming more personal. Every glance he gave, every word he spoke seemed to carry more weight than what was on the surface. This wasn't just small talk. It was a dialogue between two people who felt something was happening between them, though neither dared to name it. When our coffee arrived, we continued chatting, but now the conversation felt a bit more relaxed. We talked about trivial things, news, sports, the weather, but there was something lingering in the air, something I couldn't quite describe. It was as if every conversation we had was just a prelude to something bigger. "I saw you in the park the other day," Oliver suddenly said, looking directly at me. "You looked focused." "Yeah, I run there often," I replied, feeling my throat dry up. "It helps me unwind." He nodded, and I realized I was trying not to break eye contact. There was something in his eyes that made me feel both vulnerable and alive at the same time. "I think it's a good way to distract yourself," he continued, "especially when there's so much routine around." That feeling again, as if he was talking about something more than just a simple walk in the park. It felt like a challenge, an invitation to look at my life from a different angle. And in that moment, I realized I wanted to know more about him. Something inside me was drawn to this man, and I couldn't understand what exactly. "Yeah, routine can be suffocating sometimes," I agreed, trying not to reveal too much of my thoughts. "But sometimes it's what gives you stability." Oliver raised his eyebrows, smiling. "Perhaps. But sometimes stability can become a trap." Those words struck me like lightning. I took a silent sip of my coffee, unsure how to respond. He was right, but at the same time, I couldn't allow myself to admit it out loud. Our conversation was turning into something more than just a casual chat at a cafe. We sat there for a few more minutes before I realized I needed to go. I had a lot to do, but I couldn't bring myself to leave that place. "I should get going," I finally said, trying to smile naturally. "It was nice chatting." "Likewise," he replied, his voice soft, almost muted. "Hope to see you soon." There was nothing unusual in his words, but they left a strange feeling of incompleteness, as if a conversation between us had happened, but remained unfinished. I felt it in every fiber of my being. It was as if we were both waiting for something that was supposed to happen, but hadn't. As I left the cafe and headed to my car, a wave of thoughts washed over me. This man, who had been just a neighbor to me not long ago, had now become something more. And while I tried to convince myself it was just friendship, inside, I had too many questions. What did his look really mean? And what was this strange attraction I couldn't explain? All I knew was that our encounters were becoming more personal, and something within me was changing. Only a few days had passed since our meeting at the cafe, but thoughts of Oliver wouldn't leave my mind. I felt like I was stuck between two worlds. One was familiar and calm, with Kyle, our home, and our rhythm of life. The other was new and alluring, embodied by Oliver. This world was filled with the unknown, with excitement, and that scared me more than anything. I tried not to think about him, but the more I tried to silence my thoughts, the more persistently they came back. Oliver had become a beacon, constantly drawing my attention no matter where I was. Whether I was cooking dinner, doing housework, or simply sitting next to Kale, my thoughts inevitably returned to Oliver. It was inexplicable, but I couldn't fight it. "Ellie, are you listening?" Kyle suddenly asked at dinner, interrupting my thoughts. I looked up and tried to gather myself. He was telling me about some meeting at work, but I couldn't recall a single word of his story. I had been too caught up in my own thoughts, and it was becoming a problem. "Sorry, I was lost in thought." I tried to excuse myself with a smile. "What did you say?" Kale gave me a quick, suspicious look, but thankfully, he didn't pursue the topic. He repeated his story, and I nodded at the appropriate moments, though my attention was once again drifting far away. I felt a pang of guilt. How could I be thinking about Oliver while sitting at the same table with my husband? Kale had always been there for me, supporting me, and we had spent so many years together. Yet now, his presence didn't stir in me the feelings it once did. I no longer felt that spark that had once connected us. Every time I caught myself thinking about Oliver, something inside me stirred. I tried to convince myself it was just a passing infatuation, a temporary distraction from routine. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't. I began to wonder, what if there really was something between Oliver and me? What if it wasn't just fleeting attraction, but something more? At night, I tossed and turned in bed, trying to quiet my conscience. Kale slept peacefully beside me, his breathing calm, and every time I looked at him, I felt the guilt growing inside me. I loved him, I knew that, but why then did my thoughts keep drifting back to Oliver? Why couldn't I shake this strange, yet thrilling excitement? Sometimes, as I walked down the street, I found myself glancing around, hoping to see Oliver. I didn't know what I expected from these encounters, but every time I saw him, my heart would race. In his presence, I felt alive, and that scared me. I knew I was playing with fire, that this game could turn into something serious, but at the same time, I couldn't help myself. One evening, when Kale was working late again, I found myself alone at home. I decided to make myself a cup of tea and try to relax, but instead, my thoughts returned to Oliver. I remembered his gaze in the park, his words at the cafe. It was as if he could see through me, understand more than I was ready to admit. I suddenly realized that I missed those encounters, missed the feelings they gave me. This realization hit me harder than I expected. I understood that I was beginning to depend on these thoughts, on this attraction. I knew it was wrong. I was married. I had Kyle, who, despite our small misunderstandings, was my reliable support. But was that enough? I began to doubt it. Each day, my internal struggle grew stronger. I tried to convince myself it was just a phase, that everything would go back to normal if I tried to distract myself. But it was useless. I found myself more and more often thinking about how I could, accidentally, run into Oliver again. These thoughts were slowly taking over. One day, while out for a run in the park, I saw him again. He was walking along the path, and our eyes met once more. I couldn't help but smile, and to my surprise, he smiled back. It was a simple, fleeting smile, but it reignited that strange excitement I had been trying to suppress. "How's it going?" he asked as we drew closer. "Good," I replied, trying to appear calm, though inside everything was churning. "And you?" "Not bad." He stopped and looked at me with that same enigmatic smile. "I see you here often." We exchanged a few more words, but I sensed that something in the conversation was left unsaid. As if behind the simple words, there was something deeper that neither of us was ready to express. When I returned home, the same guilt washed over me. I tried to convince myself that it was just friendship, that I wasn't doing anything wrong. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. And this knowledge slowly ate away at my inner peace. Now, I was fighting with myself every day, trying to find an answer to the question that wouldn't leave me alone. How far was I willing to go for these feelings? And was it worth it? Until I could find the answer, all I could do was continue this battle, with myself, with the thoughts that wouldn't let me go for even a moment. The summer was in full swing, and the warm evening became the perfect excuse for a small backyard barbecue. Kale loved such evenings, lively conversations with neighbors, the faint smoke from the grill, the smell of fresh meat, and cold beer. He was always the life of the party when it came to such events. We invited close friends, and this time, Kale suggested inviting Oliver. I didn't know how to feel about it, but I had to agree, trying not to reveal the inner tension I was feeling. Oliver arrived on time, as always, looking impeccable. He wore a simple shirt and jeans, but it only highlighted his charisma and confidence. As soon as he walked into our yard, I felt a slight tremor, which I hoped was invisible to others. We hadn't crossed paths with him for quite some time, and this evening, our gazes met again, as if everything that had happened between us in our thoughts finally materialized. "Hey, Oliver, glad you could make it." Kale greeted him with a warm smile and a friendly handshake. "Thanks for the invite," Oliver replied, nodding at me. His voice was calm, but in his eyes, I caught something more than just a simple greeting. Something hidden, yet so obvious that I could barely suppress the tingling inside. I was relieved when Kale got distracted by the grill, giving me time to collect my thoughts. I watched as Oliver easily joined the conversation with our friends, his openness and sense of humor instantly winning everyone over. But every time his gaze accidentally landed on me, there was tension between us that seemed to be felt only by us. "Ellie, could you help with the drinks?" Kale asked me, and I nodded, momentarily forgetting everything. I headed to the house, hoping that a brief pause would help calm me down. But when I returned with the tray, Oliver was beside me. He offered to help, and the moment our hands touched, I felt a slight spark between us. It was just a small touch, but it stirred up a storm inside me. "Thank you," I said, trying not to show my emotions. "Happy to help," he replied with that same enigmatic smile. For a moment, our eyes met again, and I realized that Oliver felt the same. This was something more than just friendship or a simple attraction, but neither of us dared to say it aloud. The evening continued, but I could feel the underlying tension all the time. Kale was in a great mood, laughing with our friends and telling funny stories. Oliver, on the other hand, was more reserved, though still engaging in the conversation. But every time I caught his gaze, it was filled with something that was impossible to ignore. As the sun began to set and the evening turned into a soft twilight, I felt the tension between Oliver and me reach its peak. He stood near the grill, helping Kale, and I couldn't help but notice how his presence affected me. Inside, there was a strange feeling growing, as if something was about to happen, but I couldn't figure out what exactly. "Is everything okay?" Kale asked, approaching me with a plate of meat. His face was so calm, so familiar, that I felt a pang of guilt again. Why was I reacting to Oliver this way when I had Kale? But that inner voice wouldn't leave me alone, reminding me of every glance, every touch that Oliver and I had exchanged. "Yeah, everything's fine," I replied, trying to smile. But inside, everything was boiling. When the evening finally came to an end and the guests started leaving, Oliver stayed a little longer. He helped Kale clear the table and see off the last guests, but I felt that his lingering wasn't accidental. We were left alone for just a few moments when Kale briefly went into the house, and it was enough for our eyes to meet again. Thanks for the evening, Ellie, Oliver said quietly, and his voice sounded almost intimate. You're always welcome, I replied, feeling my heart start to beat faster. We both knew those words meant more than just gratitude for dinner. There was something more between us, but neither of us was ready to voice it. Once again, I felt that magic, that spark that hadn't let me go for a minute. When Oliver left, I went back inside, feeling that this evening had left me with even more questions. Once again, I found myself facing a choice that weighed more and more heavily on me. How long could I resist these feelings? And what would happen if I allowed myself to cross that line? Cale, unaware of anything, fell asleep on the couch in front of the TV, while I sat next to him, feeling the weight grow in my chest. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, but I had no idea what to do next. The day after the barbecue, I tried not to think about what had happened, but thoughts of Oliver kept surfacing in my mind. All the hidden tension that had developed between us seemed impossible to ignore now. I tried to distract myself with work, household chores, and any small task, just so I wouldn't think about how far our glances and gestures had gone. But it was useless. Several days passed since I last saw Oliver, and I had almost convinced myself that I could return to my normal life. But one morning, as I was getting ready for a run, I received a message. It was from Oliver. Ellie, do you have time for a walk? I need to discuss something about the fence. The fence? It was the most innocent excuse he could have come up with. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about the fence. Oliver was making the first move, and the feeling consumed me completely. I felt a growing sense of excitement. I knew that by agreeing to this walk, I was crossing a line that had, until now, only existed in my thoughts. Of course, when's convenient for you? I replied, trying to sound calm, though inside, everything was swirling. We agreed to meet that evening, and I spent the whole day in tense anticipation. My life suddenly felt split into two parts, one where Cale, our marriage, and stability existed, and the other, a world filled with uncertainty, attraction, and Oliver. I knew I was doing something wrong, but for some reason, that only fueled my curiosity. The evening was quiet, with a light breeze pleasantly brushing my face as I stepped outside. Oliver was already waiting by his house, leaning against the fence, which was supposedly the reason for our meeting. He was dressed casually, but looked impeccable, as always. His eyes, full of calm and mystery, met mine, and once again, I felt that inner flutter. Hey, I said, approaching, trying not to show my nerves. Hey, Ellie. His voice was soft, as if we were the only people in the world. Thanks for agreeing to meet. I needed to discuss a couple of things. I nodded, even though I fully understood it wasn't about the fence. We started walking slowly down the street, and the silence seemed to envelop us like a blanket. Each step we took was careful, as if we were walking along the edge of a cliff from which there was no return. I wanted to talk to you about a project I'm planning to start at the house, he began, but his voice sounded distant. I knew he was only saying it to fill the silence. Of course, I replied, trying to keep the conversation going, but inside, everything was screaming that this wasn't just a casual chat. A few minutes passed as we continued walking, talking about completely irrelevant things. Yet, each of his words seemed to carry a hidden meaning. Finally, when we reached a small park, he stopped and turned to face me. Ellie, his voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. I think you know this walk isn't about the fence. My heart started to race. I looked at him, unable to say a word. All the tension that had been building between us over the past few weeks had now reached its peak. And finally, Oliver voiced what had been hanging in the air from the beginning. I can't pretend anymore, he continued, stepping closer. There's something between us, and I think you feel it just as much as I do. My thoughts spun in a whirlwind. I knew this moment would come, but now that it was here, I didn't know how to react. My heart was screaming one thing, while my mind said another. In that moment, I realized I had taken the first step down a path that could destroy everything I had. Oliver, I finally found the strength to speak, though my voice trembled. This is wrong. But even as I said it, I felt part of me resisting. The inner voice telling me to stop was growing quieter, while the pull toward Oliver grew stronger. Maybe, he said softly, stepping even closer. But does that stop us? His words hung in the air, and I realized I was standing on the edge. One touch from him, and everything would change. As Oliver leaned in closer, I felt his breath brush against my skin, and I knew I had made my choice. The seconds stretched endlessly, and though I didn't move, everything inside me shifted. I knew I could no longer return to my old life. We stood in the park, bathed in the soft twilight, when what had been building for weeks finally happened between us. Oliver took the final step, and I felt the whole world around us disappear, leaving just the two of us. His face was so close, I could feel his breath on my skin, and in that moment, I could no longer resist. All my thoughts, fears, and doubts faded into the background. Our lips met. It was a gentle, almost tentative kiss, as if we both hadn't fully realized what we were doing. But there was so much passion in it, so many suppressed emotions, that I couldn't remain indifferent. His touch was both confident and delicate, as if he feared breaking this moment. I felt his hands softly encircle me, and suddenly, everything made sense. In the instant I returned his kiss, the entire world ceased to exist. There was only Oliver, his touch, his warmth. It was a release from all the boundaries I had set for myself. I felt with each passing second, with each movement, my resistance melting away, leaving only pure emotion. When we finally pulled back from each other, I saw that his eyes sparkled with the same passion I was feeling. He looked at me as though I was the only person in his world. "I've thought about this since the first day I met you," Oliver confessed, his voice soft, almost a whisper. I couldn't respond. Everything I was feeling was too strong, too deep to express in words. I just stood there, not taking my eyes off him, trying to absorb every second of the moment. He took my hand, and we continued our walk, but now everything was different. We walked down the deserted path, holding hands, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. All my inner conflict, all my doubts and guilt were left behind. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about Cale, or the fact that this could ruin my life. I was here, in the now, and that was all that mattered. Oliver started talking, but his words didn't really matter. We discussed insignificant things, nature, books we'd recently read, but that wasn't the point. What mattered was that we were together. I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly everything had escalated. Not long ago, he was just a neighbor who intrigued me with his gaze. But now there was a connection between us that couldn't be ignored. We stopped by a small gazebo in the park, where the tree branches created a cozy half-light. Oliver turned to me and took my hand again. "Ellie," he said, looking straight into my eyes. "I don't know what comes next, but I want to be with you. I can't hide it any longer." His words resonated inside me, evoking both joy and fear. I knew he was telling the truth, and it terrified me. But at the same time, I couldn't deny what I felt. This moment was too important to let go. "I don't know what to do either," I admitted, struggling to find the right words. "But I can't deny this anymore." Oliver moved closer, and I felt his warmth again. We stood there, just looking at each other, as if neither of us wanted the moment to end. And I realized that, despite all the risks, I couldn't turn back. We had already crossed a line, and the only way was forward. We spent more time together, simply walking through the park. I savored every moment, every glance, every touch. It was like magic, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. I suddenly realized that this was what I had been missing all these years. Oliver gave me something I had lost in my marriage: passion, excitement, the feeling of being alive again. By the time we returned to our houses, stars had already begun to light up the sky. We stopped at the gate, and I felt the same flutter that I had at the beginning of our walk. "I don't want to say goodbye," Oliver said quietly, his voice full of emotion. I couldn't help but smile. "Neither do I," but reality was already creeping back, and I knew I couldn't stay longer. I went home, where Cale was waiting, unaware, seeing nothing. Inside me, two worlds were battling, one familiar and peaceful, and the other filled with passion and uncertainty. And as I lay in bed that night, thoughts of Oliver wouldn't leave me. I knew that my life would never be the same again. The day started as usual. Cale left for work. His trip was supposed to last 2 days. We hugged before his departure, as we always did, and I wished him good luck. I tried to remain calm, but inside, something else was brewing, an anticipation of something unknown. something forbidden. I knew these 2 days would be different from all the previous ones. The morning started slowly. I enjoyed the opportunity to linger in bed longer while the house was wrapped in silence. It was a rare feeling of solitude that I hadn't experienced in a long time. Tired of my thoughts, I drifted into a light sleep, fully relaxed. At that moment, someone knocked quietly on the door, but I didn't hear it. I woke up to a gentle touch that at first seemed like a dream. A light, cautious brush of lips. It was so subtle that I didn't immediately realize what was happening. Slowly, I opened my eyes and saw Oliver in front of me. His face was so close, I could feel his breath. He was standing at the edge of my bed, leaning toward me, and his lips were still touching mine. "Oliver," I whispered, barely able to contain my excitement. He smiled, pulling back just a few centimeters, but his gaze remained just as intense. "Sorry for coming so early," he said softly, as if afraid to break the silence. I couldn't wait. My heart started to beat faster. I understood that his visit was risky, but the boldness, the decisiveness in his actions, was something I couldn't ignore. He had come to me when the house was empty, when no one could see us, and that added even more passion and danger to our relationship. "You came in?" I asked, still surprised. "The door wasn't locked," he replied, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "I thought you wouldn't mind." I really didn't mind. I couldn't be against what he had done. From the moment Oliver entered my home, reality became blurred. All this secrecy, this thrill of possibly being caught, only intensified my feelings for him. He leaned in again and gently kissed me, his hands gliding over my face, softly cradling me. I responded to his kiss, allowing myself to forget everything. This time, I no longer resisted my feelings. It was our moment, a time when no one else was around, and we could be ourselves. I sat up in bed, and he looked at me as if every moment with us was priceless. There was so much tension and passion between us that it felt like we wouldn't be able to hold back for much longer. "I thought about you every day," Oliver said, and his voice was full of sincerity. I couldn't wait for the moment when we'd be together again. His words warmed me, and I felt my heart literally burning with emotions. I couldn't find the words to describe what was happening inside me. Everything was so powerful, so wrong, but at the same time, so desired. "So did I confessed, my hand involuntarily reaching for his face. I ran my fingers across his cheek, feeling the light stubble beneath them. At that moment, I realized I had made my choice. This choice was filled with risks, but I could no longer resist. We sat close for a long time, enjoying each other's presence, while the house was wrapped in silence. At that moment, time stopped, and all worries disappeared. I knew that what was happening between us could destroy my life, but right now, it didn't seem to matter. What mattered was that we were here together. Oliver stood up, glanced around the house, as if considering how far he was willing to go that day. But then he returned to the bed, lay down next to me, and wrapped his arms around me. I nestled into him, feeling his warmth and the sense of safety he gave me, despite the danger of the situation. "What now?" I asked quietly, still feeling how this moment was evolving into something more. Oliver looked at me with a gentle smile. "Now, we belong only to each other, if only for this moment," he replied. "Let the world wait." And in that moment, I was ready to agree. After that morning, when Oliver quietly woke me up with a kiss, my life was irreversibly divided into two unsolvable parts. I could no longer pretend that nothing was happening. Every time Cale came home, his presence stirred in me a strange, almost painful feeling of guilt. Yet, at the same time, I found myself more and more often thinking about Oliver, recalling every touch, every moment we shared together. I stood by the kitchen window, gazing out at the garden, while Cale, as usual, sat on the couch, scrolling through the news on his phone. His calm demeanor only heightened my unease. He was so reliable, so predictable. We had spent years together, and throughout that time, I had always felt safe with him. But now, that safety no longer seemed as important to me. Inside, a conflict was raging that I could no longer ignore. How did I let things get this far? This thought haunted me. But each time I considered ending the relationship, I felt an odd emptiness. Oliver filled that void. He was the one who awakened long-forgotten emotions in me: passion, excitement, a sense of being alive. With him, I felt young and vibrant again, and it was difficult to give that up. But with each passing day, the guilt I felt towards Cale grew stronger. He suspected nothing. When he came home from work, he always asked how my day had been, and I tried to answer as naturally as possible, hiding the inner tension. But each time, it became harder. My heart was being torn apart. One part wanted to preserve our marriage, to return to the way things were, while the other desperately yearned for Oliver. Sometimes, I tried to justify my actions. Maybe I'm doing this because my marriage with Cale has become too predictable. Maybe it's just a temporary infatuation that will pass soon. But even when I found such excuses, they didn't bring me relief. Instead, I felt myself sinking deeper and deeper into this whirlwind of passion and deceit. I began to notice how I avoided talking to Cale. It became hard to look him in the eyes when he spoke about our future or plans for the weekend. I avoided his touches, his attempts to be closer. It felt like every gesture of his was a reminder of how I was betraying him each time I met with Oliver. One evening, when Cale stayed late at work again, I was home alone. Oliver didn't come over, giving me time to think. I sat in our bedroom, looking around at all the things that reminded me of our life together. The photos on the shelf, the bed linens we bought together, the books he read before bed. This was my life, the life I had built over the years. But now, every time I thought of Oliver, all these things felt foreign to me. I no longer felt like part of this life. And that was the scariest thing of all. I knew I was on the edge. If I continued down this path, I risked losing everything I had. But at the same time, I couldn't just leave Oliver. He had become more to me than just an infatuation. He was the one who had opened up a new world for me, one filled with emotions and passion that I hadn't felt in so long. "Ellie!" Cale's voice called from the living room, and I flinched. "Are you coming to dinner?" I stood up, trying to collect my thoughts, and headed to the kitchen. The battle inside me was still raging, and I knew it wouldn't end so easily. I sat down at the table across from Cale, watching him calmly eat, unable to shake the feeling that sooner or later, this secret would destroy everything. But for now, I couldn't stop. From the moment Oliver became a part of my life, I knew that sooner or later, Cale would start noticing the changes. We had lived together for too long for him not to pick up on the slightest shift in my behavior. And now, it seemed, that moment had come. In the last few weeks, I had been distancing myself more and more from Cale. I avoided long conversations with him, tried not to meet his eyes when he spoke about our future. My attention was always elsewhere, always with Oliver. I couldn't focus on my life with Cale, and it was becoming all too obvious. One evening, while we were having dinner in silence, I felt Cale watching me closely. I tried to remain calm, but deep down, I knew he sensed that something was wrong. This question had been brewing for a while, and finally, Cale decided to ask it. "Ellie," he began slowly, putting his fork down. "You've been distant lately. Did something happen?" I felt a wave of anxiety rise within me. This question was inevitable, but now that it had been asked, I didn't know how to respond. I had prepared myself for this conversation, yet here I was, completely unprepared. "No," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing happened. I've just been a little tired." Cale looked at me for a long time, his gaze full of doubt. I knew he could sense that this wasn't the whole truth. We had been too close all these years for such changes in my behavior to go unnoticed. "Are you sure?" He leaned forward, his voice soft but persistent. "Is there something you don't want to tell me? I can tell that something's going on." I felt my heart tighten. His words were true, but I couldn't tell him everything. It would destroy him, and me too. "Everything's fine, really," I assured him, trying to smile, though inside, everything was screaming with tension. "It's just work, and I guess I haven't been spending as much time with you. I'm sorry." Cale didn't believe my words right away. He fell silent, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was still trying to figure out what was happening. The silence between us was painful, and I avoided looking at him, afraid he would see the truth in my eyes. "I just want you to be happy," he finally said, his voice calm, but I knew there was more behind it. "If something's wrong, you can always tell me." Those words cut me deeper than I expected. I knew Cale had always been devoted to me, always tried to be the best husband he could be. But now, I had distanced myself from him, and it was starting to tear us both apart. I nodded, trying to reassure him, though inside, everything was boiling over. "Thank you," I said quietly, and that conversation ended, at least for a while. But from that moment on, Cale started asking me more questions, observing my behavior, searching for signs that I was hiding something. His suspicion grew, and I began to notice how he would come home earlier more often, check on my plans, ask more questions about where I had been. The tension inside me grew day by day. I still couldn't stop seeing Oliver, but at the same time, I knew that sooner or later, Cale would figure it out. His suspicions were taking root, and all I could do was hope I could keep the truth hidden for just a little longer. Each meeting with Oliver was like a spark igniting a fire that grew brighter and stronger with every encounter. Our stolen moments, our secret kisses, our touches, each filled me with something I had been missing. It was like a drug I couldn't refuse, despite all the risks. We met in the same places, at the park, on deserted streets in the evening, or sometimes at Oliver's house, when I was sure Cale wouldn't suspect anything. With each meeting, our passion became more uncontrollable. I felt as though Oliver was filling every corner of my mind. In his arms, I lost myself, forgetting all the moral barriers and obligations that tied me to Cale. But with every encounter, the weight of knowing this couldn't last forever grew heavier. I began to notice how this double life was destroying me from the inside. I couldn't find peace at home when I was near Cale. Every touch from him stirred a sharp sense of guilt within me. But at the same time, I couldn't give up Oliver. One day, when we met again at his house, the atmosphere was particularly tense. We both knew that our attraction had become not just stronger, it had become uncontrollable. It was a mixture of passion and pain that pulled us toward each other, despite the consequences. "Ellie," Oliver whispered as we stood in his bedroom, his arms wrapped around me as if he was afraid to let go. "You know this can't go on forever, right?" His words struck me so suddenly that I froze for a moment. He was right, and I knew it. We had gone too far to stay at this level. Sooner or later, everything would collapse. "I know," I replied, looking into his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. "But I can't stop. I don't want to." Oliver tightened his grip on my shoulders, his gaze filled with passion and some internal struggle. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But what are we going to do next?" That question had been hanging in the air for a long time, and I didn't know how to answer it. Our relationship was like a gust of wind, uncontrollable and fast-moving, but at the same time, it threatened to destroy everything I had ever known. I understood that Cale was starting to suspect something. His gaze had become more scrutinizing. He was beginning to notice little things that I had been able to hide before. But at that moment, standing next to Oliver, I couldn't think about anything except the two of us. I clung desperately to these moments, knowing they might be our last. "I don't know what's next," I finally answered, feeling my thoughts blur. "But right now, I just want to be with you." He leaned toward me again, and our lips met in a passionate kiss. It was a moment of pure honesty, when all our doubts faded into the background. We both knew this passion was sweeping us away, and stopping it would be impossible. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about the future or what awaited us. I was living in the present, immersed in our feelings. We spent hours together, savoring every moment we had. Every touch, every kiss seemed filled with something more than just desire. It was a passion that had become a necessity for both of us. Yet, at the same time, I could feel the growing sense of unease inside me. When I returned home, Cale was sitting in the living room again, as if nothing had happened. But I already knew I wouldn't be able to keep up this game much longer. My relationship with Oliver had reached the point where secrecy could no longer be sustained. And I knew that the time when I would have to make a choice was approaching relentlessly. Everything happened so suddenly that I didn't have time to prepare. It seemed that the secret attraction between Oliver and me would last forever, that I could maintain the balance between two lives. But I was wrong. Cale found out the truth by accident. It was an ordinary morning. I was getting ready for work when I saw his face suddenly change. He was standing in the bedroom doorway, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and anger. In his hands was my phone. He held it as if it were something dirty, something that had stained his life. "What is this, Ellie?" His voice was quiet, but I could hear the danger in it, like thunder before a storm. I froze, not understanding what he was talking about until I noticed the screen of my phone was open to a message from Oliver. It was an unforgivable oversight. I hadn't even remembered leaving it on the kitchen table. "Cale," I started, trying to find the right words, but nothing came to mind. "Have you been seeing him?" His voice grew louder, and now the anger he could no longer contain was evident. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" I felt a cold wave washing over me, leaving me speechless. In that moment, I couldn't find any excuses, no lie that could save the situation. Everything was out in the open, and there was no point in denying the obvious. "It's not what you think," I began, though I knew those words were meaningless. "Then what is it, Ellie?" Cale stepped closer to me, his face distorted with pain and betrayal. "You can't lie anymore. I know you've been meeting him. I've seen you and him." Those words hit me like lightning. I had no idea Cale had seen us. He was supposed to have been away for work that day, but he must have returned early and caught us in one of our secret moments. "I'm sorry," I whispered, not knowing what else to say. "Sorry?" His voice filled with bitterness. "That's all you have to say? You destroyed our marriage, and you just say, sorry?" I looked at him, feeling every cell in my body scream with guilt. But what could I do? My entire world was crumbling right in front of me, and I was the only one responsible for its destruction. "How could you?" Cale continued, his voice trembling. "I thought we were happy. I trusted you. I believed in you. And you betrayed me." I couldn't look him in the eye. Every word he said cut me to pieces, making me feel the full weight of what I had done. I had betrayed the person who had been by my side for so many years, who had been loyal to me, who had loved me. "It wasn't that simple," I finally said, trying to explain my feelings. "I got confused, Cale. Confused?" He interrupted, his voice sharp again. "Confused enough to start seeing another man behind my back?" His pain was so deep that I couldn't bear it. I knew that nothing I said would make it better, and I knew that he would never be able to trust me again. "I can't take this anymore," he said, suddenly quiet, but his words sounded like a final verdict. "Leave, Ellie." Those words knocked the ground out from under me. Leave? Where? I couldn't imagine that I had actually made this choice, and now I had to face the consequences. "Cale," I tried to speak, but he raised his hand, stopping me. "I don't want to see you anymore." His voice was cold as ice. "I can't forgive this. Just go." I was silent. Everything inside me screamed that this couldn't be the end, that I had to do something to fix it. But I knew there was nothing left to fix. I packed a few things, avoiding looking at Cale. I could feel the weight of the breakup hanging over us, and it was unbearable. But I knew that I had made my choice long ago, and now I had to face it. As I left the house, leaving Cale behind, I felt empty inside. I had lost not only my husband, but a part of myself. When the door closed behind me, I realized that my old life was left behind. Everything between Cale and me had crumbled in an instant. But I knew this wasn't just a breakup. It was a choice I had made. A choice that had changed me and my life forever. Inside me, a storm of doubt, fear, and pain raged. But I also felt that this step was inevitable. The first few hours after leaving home were the hardest. I sat in my car, just sitting, not knowing where to go. I couldn't go back to Cale, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what awaited me with Oliver. The choice, which had seemed so right in moments of passion, now suddenly came crashing down with its full weight. I was torn between the fear of a new life and the certainty that this was the right thing to do. I sent Oliver a message. "I did it. I left." His response came quickly. Oliver invited me to come to him, and although I felt a flutter of nerves, I realized I had no other path now. Oliver and I had started this journey together, and no matter how difficult it was for me, I had to see it through to the end. When I arrived at his place, Oliver greeted me at the door. His face was filled with sympathy and warmth, and suddenly I felt like at least one person in this world understood me. His embrace was comforting, offering the sense of protection I had been missing. "I'm proud of you, Ellie," he said as I stepped inside. "It was a hard step, but you made the right choice." His words penetrated deep into my soul, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this decision might change my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. Now I stood at a crossroads, between the past I had left behind and the future that was only just beginning. The first few days with Oliver were filled with uncertainty. We spent time together, like before, but now that I was no longer tied to Cale, everything felt different. I tried to adjust to the new reality, but it wasn't easy. Oliver was kind to me, took care of me, but I still felt an emptiness inside. We talked about the future, about how we would now build our life together. Oliver made plans, full of enthusiasm, describing how we could start something new together. He was full of energy, and his determination seemed like something that should have inspired me. But I couldn't get rid of the thought that with every step forward, I was losing a part of myself. Every morning, I woke up next to him, and those moments were both pleasant and painful. We grew closer, our relationship deepened, but I still couldn't find my place. It felt as though I had given up everything for this feeling, but now I wasn't sure if it was worth all the losses. Cale didn't reach out to me. His silence was heavy and final. I knew he would never forgive me, and I understood that this was the end. I could no longer go back to my old life, even if I wanted to. I tried to convince myself that now, with Oliver, everything would be different, that we could build something new and better. But inside me, there was still a void that I couldn't fill. As time went on, I began to realize that this new life wasn't bringing me the relief I had hoped for. With Oliver, I felt free, but that freedom didn't give me the satisfaction I had expected. Perhaps I had become too attached to the image of passion and novelty, forgetting that any real life comes with responsibilities and compromises. One evening, sitting on the balcony of his house, I began to reflect on what lay ahead. I stared at the stars and felt my thoughts swirling around me. Oliver came and sat beside me, taking my hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. I froze for a moment, unsure how to answer. Inside, there was still a struggle, between my feelings for him and what I had lost by leaving Cale. "About how life is never the way we imagine it," I finally said, and those words were true. Oliver remained silent, but I felt that he understood. Several months had passed since I started my new life with Oliver. At first, everything seemed thrilling, the passion between us was still strong, but over time, I began to realize that this passion couldn't replace what I had lost. Life with Oliver was different, but it wasn't better. It wasn't worse either, but it certainly wasn't the fairy tale I had imagined. Cale no longer appeared in my life. His absence was like a sore tooth that no longer hurts, but leaves a strange, unpleasant feeling of emptiness. We never spoke again. He made the choice to erase me from his life, just as I had chosen to leave for Oliver. But something inside me screamed that I had lost not only a husband, but a part of myself. Oliver tried to maintain an atmosphere of love and care. He was attentive to me, making efforts to ensure I felt comfortable. We often laughed, spent time together, but deep down, I knew that this new life was built on the ruins of the old one, and those ruins continued to loom in front of me. One evening, when Oliver was at work, I found myself alone in his house. I sat in the kitchen, watching the shadows from the windows stretch across the floor. My mind was blank. My thoughts drifted back to the moments when I was still with Cale. I remembered our home, our quiet evenings, and suddenly it all seemed so distant and unreal, like someone else's life. I thought about how I hadn't just destroyed my marriage, but also myself. My desire to be with Oliver, that passionate attraction, it all seemed like something that was supposed to bring happiness. But now I understood that passion alone couldn't serve as the foundation for a real life. It felt as though I had built a bridge to nowhere. My attempts to justify my actions were dissolving, leaving behind only a bitter reality. I thought I could escape the routine, the predictability, that with Oliver, my life would be bright and full. But now I saw that this brightness was temporary. It dimmed with each passing day, leaving only memories and unfulfilled expectations. Oliver returned home, and his presence once again filled the house with warmth. He came up to me, hugged me from behind, but I felt something stir in my chest. It no longer seemed that his touch could heal my soul. We exchanged a few words, and he kissed me on the cheek. But inside me, the feeling grew that something had been lost forever. I was no longer the Ellie who once lived a quiet life with Kale. But I wasn't the Ellie who longed for passion and freedom either. Now, I stood somewhere between these two worlds, and both felt foreign to me. One day, I realized that I could no longer continue living as if something would change. I made a decision that, perhaps, was the hardest of all. I understood that no passion could compensate for the losses I had experienced. Oliver had become something important in my life, but he wasn't someone who could fill the emptiness that remained inside. I didn't know where this new path would lead me, but I knew one thing: I could no longer stay in a life that didn't bring me peace. That evening, I left the house and walked slowly down the street, knowing that this was the end of one chapter of my life. I didn't know what awaited me next, but now I was ready to face this path alone. I now understood that what matters is not who you live with, but how you live with yourself.